Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Accelerator Weekly Webinar. This is Ricardo, and today I'd like to talk to you about the main challenges a developer or designer faces when building or designing apps for mobile platforms. When you're building your app, the architecture of your app plays a big part in the overall strategy, and starting with the right foundation will definitely play a fundamental role in your overall development phase. This webinar will be a high-level conversation. I will not get into too much code or specifics of code. And I'll be explaining the concepts using as many examples as I can whenever possible. In this process, I will share with you my top 10 tips for successful cross-platform development with Accelerator. The session will run for, let's say, like an hour, a little bit less maybe, because I wanna just leave enough time for questions. Feel free to use the chat area on the right-hand side of your screen to write questions, and I'll get to them at the end of the webinar. I see that there's some questions already that have been asked. Some of them are very technical, and I will probably not have time to get to those very technical ones. But we are definitely taking notes, and some of them could very well become topics for a full webinar. So in the end, I'll give you the email address, because we need to know exactly about the topics you would want us to talk about in future webinars. So let's get started with the 10 tips for successful cross-platform development using Accelerator. And I will count them down from 10 to 1, starting with number 10. Number 10 is beauty is relative to the platform. Let me show you an example. The Evernote app for iOS. If you're an iOS user, you've seen this app running on iOS 8. I love the look and feel of this app. I love how they use a green pattern in the background. All the navigation itself, the shortcuts, notes, notebooks, tags, places, they added that navigation as buttons that open up navigation windows. And that's a very interesting use of the navigation window as opposed to other possibilities. Like, for example, when you look at the Android one, the Android version is using the navigation drawer. It's using sorry about that, some technical problem, but we should be back now. So the Evernote app for iOS on the left-hand side, the one with the gray background, and you compare it to the Android one, and the Android one is using the different navigation pattern for the same options, the notes, notebooks, tags, and shortcuts. And if you go even further than that and look at the Windows Phone version, it's completely different. And this is exactly the same app running on 3 different devices, using exactly the same user account with the same data. And to me, it's very interesting how they made these design decisions, because they're looking at not keeping consistency across platforms, but rather making sure that they are offering the best possible experience on each one of the platforms. You can definitely build apps like this using Accelerator, even if you can have different UI and UX on different platforms using a single code base with Accelerator. And the architecture of the app plays a big part of that. I'll get to a little bit more detail on how you can set the ground for an app like this. But when you look at cross-platform development, you're actually looking at ways of reusing as much code as possible. And that leads us to number 9, that is code reuse is for logic and not necessarily for user interface code. So when you look at an app like the Evernote example, or this diagram where I'm trying to show that there's 2 apps with a button, but the button is being displayed in a different manner, the code that handles that button is code that is reused. It's reused on both of the platforms, because the UI is different, and that's something that we in many ways should embrace and not necessarily take into consideration when measuring code reuse, because by definition the user interface is going to be in many ways different across platform. And when you measure code reusability from the actual code standpoint, then with Accelerator you are approaching 100% of code reusability, depending on how you structure the code. Now, you can even take even further the concept of code reusability with Accelerator when you write your own normalization libraries. And by that, what I mean is, let's use this example. If you were to open a PDF file on an iOS device using the Titanium SDK, you will write something like this. You will use the create document viewer object that to it you will set the file name, and then you simply call show, and internally the operating system will look for the PDF, the native PDF viewer on the iOS device, and will show that file. That's fine and perfect. Now, when you go to iOS, to Android, this is the code you need for Android. There's a lot of many lines of code to achieve the same result. You have to, because of Android security model, you have to take the file from the folder, from your app folder, and then create a temporary file, moving that file to a different location, just so you can share that file with other apps on the phone. And that has nothing to do with Accelerator. It's an operating system thing, but still we have two very different ways of achieving the same result on different platforms. And in this case, you will say, well, there's little code reusability because the PDF, opening PDF code is different across platforms. So what usually people do is that they use if OS, iOS, then do this, and else, or if it's on Android, then do the Android part. But still, that creates a little bit of a problem with the maintainability of your code, because if you need to make any changes to the iOS or Android part, you have to go into the code and look for this part. So the way you will potentially write a normalization library for this is by creating an alloy widget. And if you add this type of conditional block with the specifics for iOS and Android inside a widget, the result is that you will have 2 lines of 100% reusable and maintainable code. So the differences between platforms, you keep them at a different level, and then the reusable code is what actually makes inside of your code. So if you need to make any changes to how the PDF is open, then you go into the library. You don't have to go into your code, so your code is reusable. Now, in terms of how to organize your code in order to implement this type of logic, one suggestion that I always give is to think web service. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. When the concept of a service-oriented architecture, as it relates to web development, is that you have a web server somewhere, and that web server has access to different network resources like databases and such. And then if you want to give access to external devices, what you do is you build RESTful APIs. And those APIs are the ones who can touch your data on your web server, and the devices or computers outside of your network will simply access the RESTful API. And emphasis on RESTful, because the concept of RESTful APIs is that they are stateless. And the concept of stateless is really important, because it creates for you a layer of communication layer that can be used by any client, provided that they have access to the API, but can be used in a almost limitless fashion. For example, if you look at Twitter, they expose the RESTful API, and then you can build a Twitter client on top of their services, and you don't have to touch the internals, and you can change all the UI and all the UX completely independent to the actual backend part. So if you implement such an architecture on your mobile app, you're looking at having your views on one side. It doesn't matter if they look the same across platforms or they're different. You have them on one side, and then on the other side, you have a set of abstract and decoupled stateless code libraries that then your controller talks to those libraries. So what that means is that you keep all of your programming logic in one part, one side of your project as abstract classes. So by abstract classes, what I mean is that when you call them, those libraries, they don't know if you're going to use them on a tab group, or you're going to use them on a vertical list, or you're going to use it on an Android menu on the action bar, or it doesn't matter. It's completely abstract, and then your controller takes care of handling that data and fitting into your views. And that way you will have a completely maintainable code base that can grow on the functionality side in one way, but at the same time grow and change on the UI part without having to disrupt the other. Now, as far as UI and UX is concerned, there are many platform differences, but there's one that I see over and over that I would like to talk about as well, and is the concept of tabs. Tabs could be deep or could be shallow, and I'll explain the differences. So let's look at this example. I mentioned Twitter before because it's a great example. So this is the Twitter screen for showing the feed on iOS. The first thing to notice is that the tabs are on the bottom, and this is the most visible difference. But I'm going to show you something that you probably know or maybe don't. So just follow the screen. So the tabs are on the bottom, right? So if you click on a tweet on the feed, that will open up the secondary screen that is showing you the contents of that tweet. Now notice this. This is iOS. You will get a back button to go back to the previous screen, but even on this secondary screen, you still have access to the tabs. That means that navigation that you're going back and forward is happening inside that tab. That is called in-tab navigation or deep navigation. And that's something that happens on iOS and is part of the iOS navigation structures. So let's look at the way this happens on Android. So on Android, the first difference is that the tabs are on the top, and that's normal. Then when you click on the tweet, you go to the next screen. But check this out. You have the navigation to go back, but the tabs are no longer visible. And this happens because on Android, the concept of in-tab navigation is not existent. On Android, the tabs are shallow. The tabs are supposed to show you some information. And if you click on something inside a tab, it should open a new window with its own navigation structure in case there's one that's needed. So you can have on this secondary screen, you can have your own navigation. In this case, it's only go back. But within the tab, you shouldn't have navigation. Why? Because maybe you're thinking, well, I can do that using views and replicate it. But you shouldn't do that because that messes up the functionality of the back button. Because the back button on a tab group, and this is my next screen, the tab button shouldn't be used to navigate when you're at the tab group level. The back button is not for navigating back and forth, or rather back. If you're in a tab group on Android, the back button should kill the app. And if you start playing around with the functionality of the back button, you're effectively creating a bad navigation, and it feels completely awkward for the user because there's a learning curve and it's breaking the actual functionality of the overall app. Now, there are many other platform differences that go beyond the tabs and beyond the back button, and there are many other things that relate to other operating systems. And I guess that the main question that may come to mind is that how how do I know about these things? So that is tip number 6. You must know your target platforms, and there's 2 ways of knowing them. One of them is being an actual user of the platform, and that takes time and that takes money because you have to buy devices. But the best way is by going to the actual platform documentation, and the iOS and Android, they have very descriptive and thorough information on how the platform works and how you should implement different things. If you come from with a web development background, you know that on the web you start with a blank page, a clean slate, and you can do anything on that page. And the web is not pushing you to go with one certain navigation. There's really no navigation standards for the web other than common sense or something that is a de facto standard that is used over and over on different websites. And what's more, the web gives you only a handful of screen controls, those that are part of the forms, the text fields and the buttons, but this is only a handful, and you have to style them. And that styling is up to interpretation by the developer on the web. But when you go to native platforms, and this goes the same way for desktop platforms or mobile platforms, the usability guidelines are telling you how many things should be implemented and displayed, and how buttons should render, and many important details that you should read, analyze, and study. When you know the guidelines, they will allow you to understand the visual metaphors of each platform, navigation philosophies, and I think that most important of all is that you will be able to compare them and know in which points they are similar and in which points they're just branch out and are completely different. When you're designing the app, depending on the functionality that you want to present to the user, you will know the proper way of exposing that to the user, because the amount of differences is just amazing. And finally, when you know these guidelines, you can build beautiful apps for each platform, even if you're not a designer, because if you use the controls that are given to you by the platform, they will look exactly the way they should look for the platform, and they will behave the way the user expects them to behave. And not only you as a developer, I'm assuming that you guys are watching this are developers, but not only you as developers need to know about these guidelines. You should also work with your design team. If you don't have a designer on your team, I advise you to get one, because the way the brain of a designer works is very different to that of a developer or an engineer. A designer could give you at some point platform agnostic design, for example. And I'm showing you here Instagram. Instagram is an app that is using a platform agnostic design. The differences between platforms are minor, and this is a decision they made. So your designer may give you a design like this one. This from the usability standpoint may be a good idea for different scenarios. I'll talk more about that in a second. But there are challenges to this as well, because you have to keep track of orientation changes and keep track of the size of the device so you can reposition things. But this is something that could happen. Your designer could also, if they know the user design guidelines, the platform design guidelines, they could give you design for your app that is specific to each platform. And this is also perfectly fine. There are many advantages to this. One from the adoption standpoint, and the other one from the development standpoint, because you're using controls that were already created for you. If you're a web developer, think about writing your own CSS classes versus using Bootstrap. Bootstrap is already giving you a lot of controls. So that's the native SDKs already give you a lot of controls. If your designer has no mobile experience, then you should work together and make sure that the final design decision represents something that makes sense for mobile. Sometimes if a designer has only web experience, they will try to implement web paradigms in mobile, and we as developers, we should just work hand in hand and make sure that they understand that the design choices have to do more with the audience of your app than necessarily like creative aspects of it. If you're building an app for the enterprise, for example, you might want to go with a platform agnostic design, because that will allow you to write the documentation of the app once and feed it to all the users regardless of the platform they're using. And they learn the app once, and if they switch from an iOS phone to an Android tablet, the app is rendering the same way. On the enterprise, you can get away with that, and it's probably the best bet. But when you're working with consumer-facing app, business consumer, then you're probably your best bet will probably be going with a platform-specific design, because that way you don't have to train your user. Your user already knows how to use your app, because you're using the navigation paradigms and the user controls that the user is expecting for that platform. There is no silver bullet for this. This is no there is no like this is a way of doing it. This is something that you have to take in a case-by-case basis. So it's definitely a decision that has more to do with how you want your user to adopt your app, and not so much on how much you want to save time or make your life easier as a developer. Now, from time to time, a designer will give you a design with a controller, a screen control that you have not seen as part of the Appcelerator SDK. And in that case, my tip for you is don't fear modules. The capabilities of native modules is something that should be exploited more often. I mean, if you go if you look at the amount of native modules that are available, I have just a handful here. Like, for example, a slide menu with a parallax effect for iOS. This is a module that you simply add to your app, and all of a sudden you have a native functionality that you didn't have before. The share action provider, the capability of adding a sharing button to the action bar, and it will open a drop-down menu with all the possible sharing options. This is something that you can get also with a native module. The navigation drawer layout, the native navigation paradigm for Android, you can get using a native module as well. Circular progress bar. I added this one because it's something that it looks fancy, and it's something that you would have to emulate if you don't use a native module. It's also available, and by the way, these modules are all free and open source. And finally, the one on the right-hand side, the action bar spinner navigation, that you can add a drop-down menu to the action bar on Android and have the navigation options or context switching options on the top. Another important thing to say about native modules is that Appcelerator has a very well documented native module framework. And if you or someone in your team has a native experience, and you're thinking about, well, I'm building this app, it's going to be cross-platform, and there's this feature that I need to resize some images, and I would like to do it at a native level because I have this library already written. If you know Java for Android, or if you know Objective-C for iOS, it's almost trivial to add those functionalities into a module, compile it, and expose it to your JavaScript. So if you are looking into building best-in-class native mobile apps with Appcelerator, I will encourage you to look at the large array of available modules, and look at creating modules yourself, because I guess that one of the greatest things about Appcelerator is that the target has never been to expose 100% of what's available on the SDKs. The target has been to expose the most important features, and then use the module framework to keep on expanding on those. And the community has been very active on this. If you go, for example, there are 3 main sources. I know there are many others, but the first one is going to marketplace.appcelerator.com, where you can get modules for pretty much everything, I guess, scanning barcodes or OCR or Bluetooth or anything like that. Git.io is another good source for modules. Git.io is indexing the modules that are on GitHub. And Titanium Controls is a curated list of modules that some of them are on the marketplace, some of them are on GitHub. These are just 3 places where you can go and get modules at. So the next point has more to do with how you look at the whole development process as it relates to cross-platform, and is that you, as a developer, need to love the platforms you're targeting. One advice that I always give is that you shouldn't let your personal preference influence the way you design your app. If you are an iOS user and that's the operating system you love, that doesn't mean that because you love iOS, your Android app is gonna look like iOS. Or the same thing with BlackBerry or Windows Phone or any platform you're targeting. You should treat them equally in their own right. Like in my first slide when I show you that beauty is relative to the platform, the same thing here. If you're building for iOS, try to make the best possible iOS experience. If you're building for Android, the same thing. You must love them from the developer standpoint, not necessarily from a personal standpoint. Also related to the concept of building different experiences for multiple devices is another suggestion I could give you is test often. You don't want to run into the problem of being for a full week writing for iOS and then trying to compile on Android, because that most of the time that won't work, and mostly because of what I explained before, the navigation patterns and navigation structures. If you use the ones that are given to you by the SDK, by definition, they're not going to translate across platforms. The way Android handles Windows is very different to the way iOS handles Windows. The way Android styles most elements is using an internal theming system, while iOS is just by simply specifying colors. And if you don't take those things into consideration at the design and planning phase of your app, you could be running into many problems when you test your app if you don't test it often. So I suggest that in my personal approach to cross-platform is that I build all versions at the same time. And I am constantly switching. When I add a new feature, I switch that feature from platform to platform, checking that feature is working, and that I keep on building in parallel. That's my personal approach. Your approach may be different, but just keep in mind that when you're building cross-platform, platforms are different, and Appcelerator is giving you a cross-platform SDK, but in the end, is using what the platform is giving you underneath the whole SDK. So those differences are gonna be normalized to you in many ways, but you shouldn't expect for them to behave the same way in many cases anyway. And last, or tip number 1, and I think this is kind of anticlimactic, is that you gotta be a user. When you're looking at your app, you need to look at your app from the user standpoint. This is not necessarily something that you're doing to make the life easier for you as a developer. The user is the one who's gonna actually determine the success of your app. If your app is the way from the functionality standpoint is one thing, from the design standpoint is another thing. But you should build for your user and make sure that your user plays the most important role in your design and development, the design and development of your app. I don't know if you guys remember, in 2012 there was a huge campaign at Facebook called the Facebook Droid Food, and back then they were still using like web apps, but I think this was before they switched back to native, and their user experience on Android was really bad. And what they did an internal campaign at Facebook and the headquarters, and they were asking developers or users at large to go to the HR department or IT department rather, and switch their phones for an Android phone, so they themselves could be users of the Android app and they could feel the pain of the Android users. This is exactly what I mean by be your user. It's not only to have access to the device to test the features in the development process, but you need to know how the user of a specific platform thinks and behaves and what the user expects. And if your app is built with the user in mind, I can assure you that that your app is well on its way of becoming a best-in-class mobile app. So those are my 10 tips. I wanted to keep this as short as possible so I could take some questions. Before I do that, though, if you would like to learn more about these concepts applied in real-life situations, I just wrote a book about it. It's called Build Native Cross-Platform Apps with Accelerator. And this is a beginner's book. So it's not only a beginner's book from the coding standpoint, but also from the cross-platform concepts standpoint. And it's built for web developers in the sense that I am trying to make analogies of how web works and how it compares to native. You can find more information about this at buildmobileapps.io. So now let's get into some of your questions. Okay, so I see a question about the future that is not necessarily related to this topic, but a question about the future of studio. I can't say much about that, but I can. What I can say is that there is going to be a very positive change on that. So I guess the only thing I can say about that is that there's going to be a good change that you guys are gonna really like. Yeah, there's another great question. How do I handle the layout across different devices on Android? This is a great question. I think, and I don't know why we're making the distinction between iOS and Android, but we're specifying that is Android, because the same thing goes from iOS phone to tablet. Yeah, it's difficult to keep track of those layouts and screen sizes. I think that so when you use native controls, those native controls automatically scale across the screen. For example, if you use the action bar as the main navigation of your app, you don't have to worry about the position of the bar or how to stretch it. That is, everything is handled to you by the OS. However, if you're, for example, building forms, there's and I don't know how many of you have heard of Bootstrap. Probably many of you have. Bootstrap solves a lot of problems when it comes to UI, especially with forms on the web. There's a project by one of our Accelerator employees. It's called Alloy Bootstrap. You can find it on GitHub. I don't have the link right now, but try to find Alloy Bootstrap. Basically, what it does is it implements a Bootstrap-like grid system, so you can better lay out elements. This is more suitable for forms, but I bet you can play with different options. using that using the grid system. But I think that also I should mention that on Android there's a variable or a value called the local density factor, and this has to do with how to manage different size of images. So the local density factor is a number that tells you if the device is low resolution, medium resolution, high resolution, extra high resolution, or extra high resolution, or basically it tells you what's the resolution of the device. Now, tied to that, there's a folder structure inside your images folder where you drop the images that you want to use in the case of any of those different screen sizes. So instead of creating a single image and try to scale it at runtime, most of your images should be created for those different density factors. And you create them once, and then when your app compiles, it will bundle those images. And when the app is run, depending on the device, your Android app will use the images that are right for that screen size and resolution. This is, by the way, this concept is not specific to Accelerator. This is a native behavior, and Accelerator is simply exposing to you that native functionality. So more information about this, I talk about this quite a lot in my book, but on the Android actual documentation, and there's a couple nice answers to this question on the Q&A as well. If you go to the Accelerator website, go to the community Q&A, and this question has been answered in a great amount of detail in different occasions. But again, it's not specific on how do I do this with Accelerator, but rather how the platform handles that inside. There's a question about using fonts for images. That is also a good option. I think that is that definitely will decrease the footprint of your app. I've seen some rendering problems with some libraries, but all in all, yeah, it's a good idea to use fonts for icons. Also, there are websites, and I don't have the name of this website. If you write to me through Twitter, maybe I can look it up for you. But there are websites where you can add your own images, and it will return to you an actual font file with the images you selected. Another website that I can recommend for Android image sizes is the Android Assets Studio. Just look for it on Google, and on the Android Assets Studio, there's a link for action bar and tab images, and you have it will give you a lot of different possible clip arts or platform images, but also the possibility of uploading your own. And then when you specify the resolutions you want to target, it will return to you the image scaled to the proper size in the specific folders that you need to use, and then you just transfer that over to your app's folder structure, and you're golden. Let me see what else do we have here. Yeah, I see there are more mentions about Bootstrap. Remember that Bootstrap is built for the web, and the way you lay out, and the best way of looking at these details is by comparing apps, native apps. The way you lay out things on the screen differs between platforms. Like the way you display items on a table view differs between Android ICS and KitKat, and then now with Android Lollipop, it's even different. So even when you can have like an alternative like Bootstrap, I would suggest not to rely too much on it, because you will kind of be going in the web UI route rather than using the more native type of look and feel. There's a question about rich text control without using web views. I really don't know about any, but there's definitely a way of writing modules about that. For example, I recently wrote an Android widget for displaying Markdown, and some people told me, well, you should have built a native module. And I said, well, Markdown generates HTML in the end, so it needs to use a web view. I think that the web views are not as bad as people think. I think that web views, they have their own nuances. And if you use web views by and making sure that you listen to the proper events, like on render and post layout and things like that, you can make good use of web views that will not slow down your app as many people think. There's a good talk by Patrick Seda on he gave last year rather, about, it's called Don't Fear the Hybrid, and he explains how to use web views to render charts where each row on a table view has a web view. And that's something that if you have used a web view on your accelerator apps, you know that sometimes it kind of make your app laggy. But he gave a lot of tips on how to use the proper events that are fired by the web views in order to keep it completely performant. Is there a place we can go to get help with specific bugs? That's a great question. So there are two ways of getting help. If you are trying to look for help about something you're trying to build and you're not getting it right, then the Q&A is the best place for that. But if you want to report bugs, or even if you want to find out if something is a bug because you think it's a bug, then the place is jira.appcelerator.org. Jira is JIRA.appcelerator.org. You need to create an account, and that will have basically direct access to the engineering department and the whole engineering flow. So if you add something as a bug, that will fall on someone's log, and they will check it and they will reply, because that's the main place for us to look for feedback from the community. And I, as a open source product, I encourage anyone to go in and participate in these conversations, because sometimes you guys run into some problems that even we were not able to run into during the QE process. So all your feedback is not only appreciated, but it's really needed. Great question. There's some source to start Accelerator for Beginners. Are there good best practice examples for learning real well-written apps? There are a few, but I guess that the best answer to that question is that the developer relations team is doing an effort right now on curating the content that is outside in the wild, and making sure that we can put it in a centralized place. And we are also building sample apps that not only can be used as a way of learning, but also as a way of understanding how to implement things that you probably see in other apps. Like, for example, if you would like to build an app that like the Yo app, or you want to build a map like the Uber map, or things like that, we are actively working on creating examples of things like that for the community, not only for beginners, but for anyone who's interested in them. Is there a way to reduce app size? I think that the best, there's a lot that has been written about this. I think that the best way of reducing your app size is making sure that you are not dropping graphical assets straight in the images folder, in the assets folder, because chances are that there's an asset that that was intended for iOS that you are actually shipping with the Android version. So when it comes to images, you should drop them in the actual images folder for each platform, because then when Alloy pre-compiles your app, it will strip out the things that are not needed for your target platform during that compilation, and in the end, it will simply bundle the things that are relevant to that platform. Right. So notifications on iOS and Android. Actually, I went through the documentation that we have on the developer guides, and they are actually up to date. Remember that the way, or I'm gonna just run you through the process, the way notifications work. So, and actually, this is a great example of what a cross-platform API is. So the way notifications work is that you have your phone needs to handshake, needs to register. In case of an Android phone, it needs to register with Google, and in case of Android, of iOS, it needs to register with Apple to accept push notifications for your specific app. So when your app is launched, that phone is going to actually talk to the when you get the pop-up window that says, well, do you want to allow push notifications, and you hit yes, it will go back to Apple or Google, and it will say, yeah, I am allowing that on my phone. So from there on in, then you have access to that phone, but from the actual Apple or Google console. So if you're not working cross-platform, just to establish the example, you will have to go to the Apple console and send out the message to your users, and then go to Google and do the same. So with Accelerator, we have the cross-platform push notifications. So what you do is that you create an ACS app, and Accelerator Cloud Services app, and then your phone registers with ACS, and ACS itself is registered with Apple and Google. So when you want to send a message, you simply go to ACS, send it, and it will go out to all the devices that have allowed push notifications. Now, there are different ways of displaying push notifications on iOS and Android. Like, for example, on Android, you can have like a notification that drops from the top, or you can have like a pop-up window or things like that. These differences are handled through the cross-platform SDK, and I wrote a library. You can look for it on GitHub. It's called ACS Push Mod as in module. Basically, it's a cross-platform library that you simply drop into your project. You follow the instructions on the README that tells you how to register your app with ACS and with the actual native providers. And then you simply use the library to register the device and to unregister the device in case the user wants to unregister. It's basically a normalization library that takes away the platform-specific aspects of using push notifications and makes it a lot easier. All right, so I think that covers most of the questions that were relevant to the conversation. Okay, so I think that the next thing I need to share with you is that we are always listening. There were, as I said before in the beginning, there were questions here that I intentionally am not getting into them because they are too technical and kind of require a whole webinar to talk about them. Like there were some, I just want to acknowledge that I saw some questions regarding Hyperloop, and some of them regarding workflows and grunt and threading. And I think that the best way of handling those, or any other topic that is kind of deep and complex, is by having a webinar about that topic, and just spend a whole hour. So I'm just going to ask you guys to send out any topic ideas you may have for future webinars to community@appcelerator.com, and maybe add webinar to the subject line, and we will be gathering those topics, and we will be making these webinars more often. We'll have like platform webinars, but also technical or more high-level webinars. So feel free to send us those questions and suggestions to that email address. Last thing I want to say is that I really hope that these 10 tips were useful to you, that they maybe answered some questions that you had. Maybe they created more questions to you because you didn't know some of the platform-specific details. Feel free to reach out to me on, I guess I'm easy to find, but you can find me, my name, Ricardo Alcocer, on Twitter. I'm always there, so feel free to reach out to me if you have any other question. And with that, I thank you very much for attending this webinar, and have a good one. Bye.